This is not a family conflict, and this should not be about family drama.
From a Hall of Famer's son sentenced as a sexual predator, to a dynasty torn apart in probate court, to a wife who burned her husband's career down defending him, these NFL legends built everything, and their families dismantled it. And the most shocking story? It involves a crime nobody saw coming. Kellen Winslow Sr. Let's start here because, frankly, nothing else on this list comes close to what happened to the Winslow family name. Kellen Winslow Sr. was not just a great player, he was a generational player. A tight end who single-handedly rewrote the definition of the position during his years with the San Diego Chargers. 5 Pro Bowls, a Hall of Fame bust, and one of the most iconic playoff performances in NFL history. The 1981 AFC divisional game against the Dolphins, where he caught 13 passes for 166 yards and a touchdown, playing through leg cramps so severe he had to be carried off the field. This was a man defined by dignity, by sacrifice, by the relentless pursuit of excellence. And then there was his son. Kellen Winslow II came into the NFL in 2004 as a first-round pick out of Miami, bristling with his father's athletic genes and a mouth full of fire. He called himself a soldier. He made Pro Bowls. There were seasons, brief, brilliant seasons, where you could squint and see the dynasty beginning to take shape. But somewhere along the way, whatever was living inside Kellen Winslow II broke loose into something monstrous. And when it did not just destroy his own life. It reached backwards through time and left fingerprints all over his father's immaculate legacy. In 2018, Winslow II was arrested on charges that included kidnapping, indecent exposure, and lewd conduct. The victims were not faceless abstractions. They were real women with real lives. A 54-year-old homeless woman he lured with a promise of coffee before assaulting her in his Hummer. A 17-year-old girl he at a party while she was unconscious and incapable of defending herself. A 58-year-old homeless woman he targeted after gaining her trust. A 59-year-old gardener minding her own business. A 77-year-old woman he approached with obscene gestures at a gym. Each victim told a story not just of physical violation, but of psychological devastation, lives rearranged by a man who chose the most vulnerable people he could find and preyed upon them without remorse. The defense, in an attempt to offer some explanation for the inexplicable, leaned into the NFL's ongoing concussion crisis. Winslow II's legal team argued that CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, had altered his brain chemistry and contributed to his behavior. It was a defense that, to many observers, felt less like a legal argument and more like an insult to the victims, to other CTE sufferers who have never harmed a soul, and to the idea that football could be blamed for pure, calculated predation. The court did not buy it. In 2019, he was convicted on multiple counts. After a partial mistrial, he eventually pled guilty during a retrial to avoid the possibility of a life sentence. In 2021, Judge Blaine Bowman stood before him and declared him a sexual predator, sentencing him to 14 years in state prison. Now here is where the story cuts to the marrow in ways that go beyond the criminal record. Kellen Winslow Sr. had poured himself into raising his son to be great. He had not just given him his name, he had given him a roadmap, a standard, an expectation of excellence lived out daily. Watch this moment from before any of this came to light, when Sr. was asked about his son following in his footsteps.
Well, very proud of him. Very happy for him, as any parent would be.
That is the sound of a father who believed, genuinely and completely, that the legacy was safe, that the name was in good hands. We now know how devastating that trust turned out to be. And while Kellen Sr. did not commit these crimes, he has had to live in a world where his Hall of Fame plaque exists in the same sentence as his son's prison record. As recently as 2024, Winslow II was still attempting to have his sentence reduced, citing physical trauma from football, an ongoing attempt to escape accountability that only prolonged the agony for the victims and for a father who deserved none of this. The Winslow legacy, once synonymous with heroism, now requires an asterisk the size of a stadium. Speaking of sons who grew up beneath the impossible canopy of a legend, our next story takes us to Chicago, where a man known simply as Sweetness left behind a world that would never quite be able to reconcile the man they worshipped with the man who apparently existed behind closed doors. Walter Payton. Walter Payton was as close to a mythological figure as the NFL has ever produced. Sweetness, 16,726 rushing yards, a Super Bowl ring, an MVP award, a smile that could warm a frozen Chicago afternoon. When he died of a rare liver disease in 1999, the entire country mourned, not just Bears fans, not just football fans, everyone. He was, to the public mind, not merely a great athlete, but a genuinely great man. His son Jarrett grew up knowing this, and the pressure of knowing it followed him everywhere he went. Jarrett Payton came into this world with a last name that functioned less like a name and more like a monument. He understood early that his father was not just famous, he was beloved in that rare, almost religious way that few athletes ever achieve. Here is Jarrett himself, reflecting on the precise moment he began to understand the scale of his father's stardom.
I think back in the day when, my dad retired in '87. So for me, it was kind of like around, I would say like 85, 86, around the Super Bowl time.
That sense of gradual, dawning realization that your father is not just your father, but a figure who belongs to the whole world is a beautiful and burdensome thing to carry.
When we would go to eat at one of my favorite fast food restaurants, and they would hand out these Bears cards.
And yet, Jarrett chased the dream anyway. Drafted by the Tennessee Titans in 2005, he bounced through the minor leagues, through a CFL stint, through a brief and tantalizing tryout with his father's own Chicago Bears, the team that worshipped the man whose shoes Jarrett was perpetually, unfairly asked to fill. In the end, his NFL totals amounted to 33 carries for 105 yards. The football world took note. Comparisons were drawn. Narratives of diluted dynasty circulated with the particular cruelty that sports media reserves for sons of giants. None of it was fair, and yet fairness was never really on offer. Then came the book. In 2011, journalist Jeff Pearlman published Sweetness, The Enigmatic Life of Walter Payton, and whatever remained of the saintly image began to crack. Drawing from interviews that included family members, the book detailed extramarital affairs, painkiller abuse, episodes of severe depression, and suicidal ideation, a portrait of a deeply troubled man hiding extraordinary pain beneath an extraordinary smile. The public reaction was volcanic. Fans accused the family of betrayal. Why would anyone close to Walter Payton contribute to a portrayal that complicated his beatification? The mystery has never been cleanly resolved. Jarrett and his sister Brittany navigated the backlash with as much grace as the situation allowed, but the damage to the pristine image had been done. And here is the genuinely painful irony at the center of this story. Jarrett Payton, in his post-football life as a sports anchor, philanthropist, and keeper of his father's memory, has done nothing but honor the man. His 2023 tribute on the anniversary of Payton's passing was a masterclass in love and grief, but between the career that never launched and the biography that landed like a grenade, the family's relationship with Walter Payton's legacy became something far more complicated than a simple celebration of greatness. It became a negotiation between the idol the world needed and the human being who actually existed. From Chicago and its complicated relationship with football royalty, we moved to Dallas, where another running back legend's bloodline quietly faded without ever generating the fireworks the family name seemed to promise. Tony Dorset. If the Dorset story lacks the explosive scandal of some others on this list, it makes up for it in the quieter, more sustained ache of unfulfilled potential, watching a dynasty slowly dissolve. Tony Dorset was one of the most electrifying runners in the history of professional football, a Heisman Trophy winner at Pittsburgh, a Super Bowl champion with the Dallas Cowboys, over 12,000 rushing yards in the NFL, and a Hall of Fame induction that felt not just earned but inevitable. He was the prototype of the Cowboys' star-spangled era, a symbol of flash and precision and pure, undeniable talent. His son, Anthony Dorset Jr., came into the league in 1996, drafted by the Houston Oilers, carrying a name that in Texas carried the weight of mythology. And Anthony Jr. was not a bad player. Let that be clearly stated. He compiled 290 tackles over 8 NFL seasons, moved between teams, carved out a career as a defensive back that many players would have been genuinely proud of. But many players were not being measured against Tony Dorset. Anthony Jr. was. Every week, in every city, the measuring started fresh, and the outcome was always the same. He was not his father. The media's fixation on the comparison was relentless and largely uncharitable. The same machinery that had lionized Tony Sr. now used the legend as a cudgel against the son. No Pro Bowls, no All-Pro selections, no championship ring earned through his own brilliance. Just the quiet, dignified work of a man trying to build a life in the NFL on his own terms, perpetually overshadowed by a name he had no say in carrying. the deeper wound came later. Tony Dorset Sr. was diagnosed with CTE, the degenerative brain disease linked to repeated head trauma, a revelation that reframed not just his own suffering, but the entire conversation about what the game costs the men who play it. Did the knowledge of his father's neurological deterioration complicate Anthony Jr.'s own relationship with the sport that had defined both their lives? That question has never been publicly answered in full, but it lingers over the Dorset name like smoke that refuses to clear. In the end, Tony Dorset built a singular, magnificent pedestal of achievement, and the Dorset legacy stands on one peak instead of two. Not because Anthony Jr. failed as a human being, he clearly did not, but because the machine of comparison demanded a dynasty and got instead a man simply trying to be his own person. It is, in its own understated way, a story about what it means to be swallowed whole by a shadow you cannot outrun. From Dallas, we travel to San Francisco, where a man who was arguably the most terrifying defensive back in NFL history also raised a son who had to find his own way, and whose candor about that journey tells us everything about the invisible weight of football royalty. Ronnie Lott. Ronnie Lott was not merely a great player. He was a force of nature contained within a football uniform, 4 Super Bowls with the San Francisco 49ers, 10 Pro Bowl selections, a man so committed to his craft that famously he chose to have the tip of his damaged pinky finger amputated rather than miss playing time for surgery and recovery. That is not a metaphor. That is not hyperbole. The man literally sacrificed a piece of his own body at the altar of competition. Ronnie Lott's legacy is the kind that gets carved in stone. His son Ryan Griese understood from an early age that there was no competing with stone. Listen to how he describes the calculus he ran through as a young man figuring out where he fit in a world his father had already conquered.
Oh, without a doubt. My father was a great player, obviously arguably one of the best of all time at his position and as a defensive player. So I definitely wasn't trying to fill his shoes.
There is a wisdom in that statement that belies how difficult it must have been to arrive at it. Ryan Griese did not set out to be Ronnie Lott. He set out to be himself. And that distinction, seemingly simple, required enormous intentionality.
Those shoes are in the Hall of Fame. There's no need for me to fill those shoes, but I learned a lot from my father both on the field and off.
Griese went undrafted out of UCLA, a deliberate choice to attend UCLA rather than USC, to play linebacker rather than safety, to carve his own path rather than attempt a carbon copy of his father's. He spent 7 years in the NFL as a Tampa Bay Buccaneers backup and special teamer, won a Super Bowl, and played with the quiet dignity of a man who had made peace with what he was and was not. By the standards of the broader football world, it was a solid career. By the standard of Ronnie Lott, it was unavoidably and unfairly described as underwhelming. Post-football, Nestle built a life in venture capital and philanthropy, co-founding firms and pursuing causes that had nothing to do with football and everything to do with the man his father helped shape him into. And yet, the Little Lott label followed him in media profiles, in conversation, in the perpetual framing of his story as a footnote to someone else's masterpiece. The Ronnie Lott legacy is not ruined in the traditional sense. There was no scandal, no crime, no courtroom, but it was quietly, inexorably diluted, not by failure, but by the impossibility of the task. When greatness reaches the level Lott achieved, it does not merely set a standard, it makes all other standards invisible, and every son who follows in those footsteps pays the price for his father's excellence, whether he wants to or not. From the Bay Area to Miami, our next entry brings us a family whose bond was tested, not just by the pressure of expectation, but by tragedy, and by one of the most harrowing near-death experiences in NFL history. All of it unfolding under the enormous shadow of a perfect, unbeaten season. Bob Griese. Bob Griese quarterbacked the Miami Dolphins to a 17-0 perfect season in 1972 and back-to-back Super Bowl championships, a feat so singular that for decades, the surviving members of that team would reportedly celebrate with champagne every year when the last undefeated team in the NFL finally lost. It was ritualistic, it was joyful, and when Brian Griese, Bob's son, was working as a broadcaster, and the moment finally came one year, the text messages between father and son were, by all accounts, exactly what you would hope for.
I was on the air when it happened, and so we were texting back and forth, and I said, did you pop the champagne? He's like, you're damn right we did.
That warmth, that humor, that shared celebration across generations. It is a reminder that even the most complicated family legacies contain moments of pure, uncomplicated love. But Brian's story is not uncomplicated, not by a long stretch. His mother Judy died of cancer in 1988 when Brian was just 12 years old, a rupture in the family so profound that it colored everything that came after. Bob Griese raised his sons in the glare of NFL fame with a hole at the center of the family that no amount of football glory could fill. Brian channeled that grief into football, into drive, into the kind of desperate energy that can either forge greatness or fracture under pressure. He did both. A Pro Bowl season with the Denver Broncos in 2000. But also turnovers, inconsistency, a journeyman's path that took him from team to team without ever landing firmly on the legacy he seemed capable of building. And then, the darkness of 1996, a guilty plea for malicious destruction following a college bar fight, a moment that collided head-on with the Griese family brand of quiet, composed excellence.
I was on the air when it happened, and so we were texting back and forth, and I said, did you pop the champagne? He's like, you're damn right we did.
The most dramatic chapter, however, came later, in the form of the football itself, the sport that gave the Griese family everything and nearly took the sun. Brian's broadcasting exit to pursue coaching, and the founding of Judy's House, a grief support center for children named after his mother, revealed a man perpetually trying to transform sorrow into meaning. It is in many ways an admirable story, but it is also a story in which Bob Griese's legacy of perfect seasons and pristine quarterbacking sits in awkward proximity to a son's imperfect, turbulent, deeply human journey. From the Dolphins' perfection to the Giants' grit, our next story gives us a father who was nearly as tough as they come, and a son who nearly paid the ultimate price for a sport that asked everything and gave back a scar where there used to be an organ. Phil Simms. Phil Simms was the definition of a blue-collar quarterback in a blue-collar town. 2 Super Bowl rings with the New York Giants, an MVP performance in Super Bowl 91, where he completed 22 of 25 passes for 268 yards and 3 touchdowns, a performance so pristine it stood for decades as the gold standard of Super Bowl quarterbacking. He did all of this while battling through injuries that would have ended lesser careers: a separated shoulder, a torn knee, a fractured collarbone. Phil Simms played through pain the way most men avoid it. It was his identity. It was his legacy. His son, Chris Simms, arrived in the NFL carrying that legacy like a branded iron on his back. And Chris was talented, genuinely, demonstrably talented. But the NFL does not grade on a curve for famous surnames. He bounced between teams, earned starts when opportunities arose, and tried to build something sustainable in a league that chews through quarterbacks with mechanical indifference. And then came September 24th, 2006, Tampa Bay versus Carolina, a game Chris Simms would not finish standing up. Here, in his own words, is the moment the football career he had worked his entire life to build began to slip away.
Well, it was Thomas Davis, right, and Chris Jenkins. It was kind of a double whammy. We had a play called 23Z in, and I thought I was going to have the curl route open, and somebody flashed in front of it.
The hit came. The pain was immediate, but Chris did something that his father would have recognized immediately. He played through it, assuming it was a rib injury, assuming it would fade, assuming the toughness that the Simms name demanded would carry him through.
And now I cocked the ball back because the pocket was collapsing and I was going to throw the ball out of bounds. And I saw Thomas Davis coming at me, but as I was throwing the ball and got in that compromised position, Chris Jenkins hit me from behind, and it really extended me, right?
He had ruptured his spleen. What followed was not just a medical emergency, but a systemic failure. Emergency surgery removed the spleen entirely, requiring blood transfusions. And Chris would later reveal that no team doctors had guided his recovery, that he was left to self-rehabilitate in isolation, a revelation that transformed a personal tragedy into a broader indictment of how the NFL treats players once they are no longer immediately useful. The career never fully recovered, and the family drama that followed was not restricted to the operating room. Chris has spoken about how the Simms name actually hurt his brother Matt's chances in the NFL, that the expectations attached to the surname buried Matt on depth charts despite genuine ability, a quiet resentment that reveals the double edge of football royalty. Then in 2025, a very different kind of family feud erupted. Phil Simms' retired number 11 at Penn State became a flashpoint when Chris publicly supported allowing Abdul Carter to wear it, while Phil's wife Diana and daughter Deirdre vetoed the idea. A spat played out in full public view, with reports of ghosting within the family, adding a layer of raw, modern dysfunction to an otherwise storied name. From the gridiron to the front office, Our next story is about a quarterback whose improbable, miraculous rise to the top of the NFL was matched by an equally improbable cascade of off-field controversies, many of them generated not by him, but by the woman standing beside him. Kurt Warner. Kurt Warner's story is the kind of story that Hollywood produces exactly once per generation, because if you tried to sell it as a screenplay, they would send it back to you for being too unrealistic. Stocking shelves at a grocery store, working his way through the Arena Football League, rising to become a two-time NFL MVP, a Super Bowl champion, and a Hall of Famer, all of it draped in a faith and humility that made him genuinely beloved. The Kurt Warner story was supposed to end with the clean, shining moral that perseverance and character always win out. And then there was Brenda. Brenda Warner, now Brenda Warner, met Kurt when they were both young and unproven, and she arrived in the relationship already a mother, already battle-tested, raising 2 children from a prior marriage, including a son with disabilities from a tragic accident. Their love story was, by any account, extraordinary. But extraordinary people sometimes do extraordinary things in exactly the wrong direction. In 2002, with Kurt's Rams career beginning to unravel following a broken hand, Brenda picked up the phone and called a radio station. She accused Rams coaches of lying about the severity of Kurt's injury, about the x-rays, about the timeline, about their intentions, and she demanded a trade on air in front of the entire listening public. The locker room erupted. The organization was put on notice, and Kurt Warner, caught between loyalty to his wife and the professional reality that his quarterback's voice was being drowned out by his wife's louder one, refused to address the controversy directly, which in its own way was an answer. Coach Mike Martz, already contemptuous of what he perceived as Kurt's excessive public religiosity, used media allies to paint Kurt as washed up with a crippled claw hand, a smear campaign that accelerated Warner's exit from St. Louis. The mysteries deepened with Warner's lingering suspicions about the New England Patriots. 13 years after Super Bowl XXX, he was still publicly voicing the belief that his Rams team had been cheated by Spygate, a stolen championship narrative that spoke to wounds that never fully healed. More recently, Kurt found himself under scrutiny for nepotism allegations related to his social media promotion of son EJ's college football career. The charge being that the Warner name and platform were being deployed to open doors in ways that made the football meritocracy, already imperfect, feel even more tilted. The inspirational arc never disappeared, but it accumulated enough complexity over the years to complicate the simple, gleaming narrative that Warner's story originally promised. From the field to the boardroom, our next story is about a man who built one of the most successful franchises in NFL history and left behind, as his final legacy, a family civil war so bitter and so expensive that it required $1 billion sale to bring it to any kind of resolution. Pat Bowlen. Pat Bowlen was not a player, he was a builder. Under his ownership, the Denver Broncos won 3 Super Bowls and grew from a regional football team into a $4 billion franchise, a powerhouse of the modern NFL. He was respected by peers, adored by fans, and genuinely regarded as one of the most capable franchise stewards in the history of the league. And unlike some owners who treat succession planning as an afterthought, Bowlen was meticulous. He saw Alzheimer's coming. He planned. He built a trust. He tried to protect everything he had created. It was not enough. When Bowlen stepped down in 2014 as the disease progressed, the trust he had constructed to determine succession became the battlefield upon which his 7 children began destroying each other. His eldest daughters, Beth Wallace and Amy Clemmer, launched a lawsuit in 2019, arguing that Bowlen had lacked the mental capacity to properly execute the 2009 trust, a claim that, if true, risked triggering the very disinheritance clauses designed to protect the franchise from exactly this kind of warfare. His widow Annabelle, herself battling Alzheimer's, was pulled into the legal fray in defense of the trust. His brother Bill filed a separate lawsuit demanding independent oversight of the trustees.
This is not a family conflict, and this should not be about family drama. And this is about preserving my father's wishes and his legacy.
Beth Bowlen Wallace said those words, and one suspects she believed them. But the paper trail told a different story, a story of siblings airing private grievances in courtrooms, of capacity challenges weaponized as leverage, of a franchise worth billions transformed into an estate dispute that made the Bowlen name synonymous with dysfunction rather than dynasty. A COVID-delayed trial finally ended in 2021 with the lawsuit dismissed, but the damage had been so thoroughly inflicted that the family ultimately agreed to a $425 billion sale in 2022, the only way to end end the war was to give up the kingdom entirely. Pat Bowlen had spent decades building something that was meant to outlast him. The tragedy is that it did not even outlast the legal proceedings that followed his incapacitation. What remains is a legacy of football excellence wrapped inside a cautionary tale about the limits of planning, the ferocity of family grievance, and the ways that enormous wealth can transform love into litigation with terrifying efficiency. From Denver to New Orleans, our next story involves another franchise owner who wanted nothing more than to keep his empire within the family, and who ended up, in the last years of his life, severing the very bonds he claimed to value above everything else. Tom Benson. Tom Benson rescued the New Orleans Saints from the existential devastation of Hurricane Katrina at a moment when the city itself was not sure it would survive. He won a Super Bowl in 2010 and grew the franchise into a $2 billion asset while simultaneously watching the Saints become the emotional and spiritual anchor of a city rebuilding its identity from rubble upward. For the people of New Orleans, Tom Benson was not just an owner, he was a savior. The family story, unfortunately, reads like a soap opera written by a bankruptcy attorney. The fissure opened in 2014 during what should have been a routine Saints game. A dispute between Benson's granddaughter Rita and his third wife Gail escalated into something far larger. Benson responded by firing his daughter Renee and his grandchildren Rita and Ryan LeBlanc, the so-called 3 Rs, from their executive roles within the organization, and revised his will to exclude them from team shares. His stated reasoning was that their behavior had been hostile, that they had, in his own words, tried to kill him. The word kill carries a great deal of weight in any context. In an estate dispute, it is a nuclear weapon. The 3 Rs fired back in 2015, with lawsuits alleging that Benson was mentally unfit, that his third wife Gail had manipulated a diminished man into disinheriting his own blood, and that their access to him had been deliberately blocked. Benson appeared in a competency trial and testified defiantly, projecting the composed authority of a man who insisted he knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what his family had done to deserve it. A 2017 settlement reorganized the family assets, and when Benson died in 2018, the 3 Rs deadline to challenge the will passed in 2023 without action, leaving Gail in control and the question of manipulation permanently unanswered. The relic that remains is a 149-word letter, reportedly the document in which Benson formally disowned his heirs. That triggered a $2.2 billion inheritance dispute and transformed a story of civic heroism into a gothic family drama played out in full public view. Rita's heartbroken public statements contrasted with Tom's deposition fury. The intimacy of the betrayal was total, and the legacy of the man who saved New Orleans football now lives forever in the shadow of the family he ultimately chose to leave behind. And finally, we close our list with a founder, a man who built a franchise from nothing, who helped shape the modern NFL as we know it, and whose most lasting contribution to his family turned out to be an equally distributed inheritance that became, in practice, the source of a dysfunction that threatened everything he had built. Bud Adams. Bud Adams did not inherit a football dynasty. He created one, founding the Houston Oilers as a charter member of the American Football League in 1960. Winning 2 AFL championships, and eventually relocating the franchise to Tennessee, where it became the Titans, a team that reached Super Bowl Dex Deport and came within 1 yard, one unforgettable agonizing yard, of winning it all. When Adams died in 2013, he left behind a franchise worth approximately $1 billion and an ownership structure that seemed, on paper, to reflect a man who believed in equality. His children would share the inheritance evenly. In practice, equal shares in a billion-dollar sports franchise is a recipe for the precise opposite of equal peace. The drama at the center of this particular family saga was his son-in-law, Tommy Smith, fired by Adams himself in the 1990s as CEO, reinstated after Adams' death as president of the organization, then fired again in 2015, with family shift cited as the official reason, a phrase so diplomatic it could mean almost anything, including the obvious, that the family dynamics within the ownership group had become so volatile that someone had to go, and Tommy Smith was the most convenient exit. Here is Smith himself, in a moment from before all the turbulence, describing how he managed the family business.
This is a family business. Many teams are family businesses, and I do involve the family. I talk to them, one of them daily, almost hourly. I'm very close with both Susie and Amy.
The veneer of functional family communication was, it turned out, precisely that, a veneer.
Talk with them both, of course Susie all the time, and Amy almost daily also, and with Kenneth and so forth. So the family's involved. They know what we're doing. They know what we're thinking. but the decision will be mine.
Bud Adams' daughter, Susie, Tommy Smith's own wife, sold her 1/3 ownership stake in 2020 to her sister Amy's group, allowing Amy to consolidate majority control in order to satisfy NFL ownership bylaws. The estate of a deceased son named Kenneth held another third, complicating every vote and every decision. The franchise that Adams had poured his life into building was, for years, functionally paralyzed by the inheritance structure he had believed was fair. Sports Illustrated's reporting on NFL succession dramas identified the Adams family situation as one of the league's most illustrative cautionary tales, a case study in how the best intentions, expressed in a will without accounting for the practical realities of shared control, can produce outcomes that would horrify the person who wrote the document. Bud Adams built a pioneer's legacy. He helped shape an entire league, and the thing he left behind for his family turned out to be, in the end, a problem that money and love together could not solve cleanly. If you enjoyed this video, click on any of the cards on your screen for more exciting videos.